This is the British Broadcasting Corporation. I'll Eat My Hat, a series of illustrated talks on the history of sports broadcasting on the wireless. Your presenter is Mr. Desmond Lynam.
Hello, today we go back to the very beginning, a time before the phrases Arsenal are playing from left to right and we'll take each game as it comes had ever been spoken. The first sports broadcast of any kind in this country was in 1922, 6 months before the BBC was even invented. Robert Hudson, a post-war commentator and head of outside broadcasts, explains.
We owe that to a very talented team of engineers from the Marconi Company, who operated from the early part of 1922 from a little hut at a place called Writtle near Chelmsford. And it was they who actually put on the first sporting commentary. This was a boxing contest between Kid Lewis and Georges Carpentier from Olympia. So that, in fact, was the first sporting OB.
There were no more commentaries for 5 years. The formation of the British Broadcasting Company in 1922 wasn't welcomed by the newspaper industry, who saw it as a threat to their sales. It was thought that if the public had heard a commentary on a sporting event, they wouldn't want to read about it the next day. The BBC agreed not to put out any news bulletins which included information about sport. The rules were changed when the BBC became a corporation on January the 1st, 1927. The catalyst, though, came the previous year, according to Robert Hudson.
Well, in the very early days, from 1922, in fact, to 1927, there was, in fact, virtually no live sport on the air at all. And the main reason for that was that the BBC had no news department of its own. This all changed with the general strike of 1926. Suddenly there were no newspapers. The BBC got together its news department, broadcast news bulletins throughout the day, and the newspapers, who had not allowed live broadcasting because they thought it would affect the sale of their newspapers, were nonplussed, as it were. The BBC became a corporation, it had its own news department, and sports broadcasting really took to the air in a big way from the beginning of 1927.
The inspiration behind the first commentaries was Lance Severking, who later became renowned as an innovative drama producer. It was he who ran auditions to find a commentator for the first broadcast, a rugby union international between England and Wales at Twickenham. One of those auditioning was the 34-year-old former skipper of Harlequins, Captain H.B.T. Wakelam, who later recalled the experience with Rex Alston.
There were 3 of us chosen.
Yes.
And one was the rugby correspondent of one of our best-known papers, and another was a friend, I think, of Sir John Reith's, but he unfortunately had a stammer, and that wasn't very much good. Anyhow, we set off on the Wednesday before the match, which was to be played on the Saturday, and went down to Guy's Hospital ground on River Park. When we got there were no engineers and no match. And so we hurried over to Greenwich Park, where we heard it was likely that they'd gone. And when we got there, they were there, but the park keepers and the police wouldn't allow them to put the microphone up. And all the gear and necessary things.
So you had no proper test?
Well, we did, because I knew there was a schoolboys match the next day at Richmond. And we went down there. And when we'd finished that, Lance turned to me and said, "Will you take the job on?"
Captain Henry Blythe Thornhill Wakelam, who thankfully was more commonly known as Teddy, broadcast the first BBC sports commentary on January the 15th, 1927. He was stationed in a hut on a scaffold platform in the southwest corner of the ground. Alongside him was an assistant commentator, sometimes called a number 2, sometimes called a Dr. Watson. Also there to help was a sign with 2 words written on it.
A large notice in red inside the box which said, "Don't swear." And then we had the chap, as I number 2, who was a Dr. Watson, at once christened Dr. Watson by the press. And he was a very nice chap, but he didn't know anything about the game at all. In fact, he asked me at one pause, do they always play with an oval ball?
sitting beside Teddy Wakelam at that first commentary was somebody whom nowadays we call the number 2, whose job then was to intone square 1, square 2, square 3, because in the Radio Times there was a chart marked out in 8 squares, and this supposedly enabled the listener to follow the game. If the number 2 said square 3, that's where the ball was. But now, of course, our commentators are trained to pinpoint the position of the ball, we hope anyway, without the aid of a diagram in the Radio Times.
It's from this use of squares that the phrase "back to square one" is derived. Although this first commentary was unsurprisingly never recorded, we do have a record of it. As part of a programme to commemorate the BBC's first home, Savoy Hill, a number of early commentaries were recreated, including this first one.
Well, the first half has been about as exciting as anyone could wish for. Oh, I can't go that. They're off again. They're changing over. It's Wales' kick this time. Pearl's taking it. He's kicking to the left. Wales defending the south end now.
Square 7.
There he goes. A long one. Sellers caught him. He's kicked back and found touch just about the halfway line. Wales' ball. Harding's throwing it in. A fairly long one. England have it. I think it's Tucker. It's down on the ground. England have healed. Out to Wharton. Now to Laird. Corbett. Locke. Out to Gibbs. Gibbs is going down the line. He's got past Andrews, and he's up to the 25. He's kicked across. The English pack are up, but Turnbull's there. Oh, well done, sir. He's made a mark inside his own 25, almost under the bar.
Square 2.
Saves an awkward situation, that.
I think it would be fair to say that by today's standards, Teddy Wakelam wouldn't rate very highly. He spoke in a rather jerky manner, and he didn't have the basic idea of the geography of description of sport, which is so absolutely essential today, to keep the listener, as it were, behind your skull, looking at the game through the commentator's eyes. He hadn't really grasped that point. But technically, I mean, he was a very good rugby player himself, and from that point of view, the commentary was good, but it didn't really convey very much of an impression.
A week after the first rugby commentary, it was football's turn, and again Teddy Wakelam took the microphone. But the first voice of football was really George Allison, a football writer on the News Chronicle, who later took over as manager of Arsenal on the death of Herbert Chapman in 1934. Here's another recreation, this time from the 1928 FA Cup final between Blackburn and Huddersfield.
There goes the whistle, and now we're off. The ball has been sent over from the centre to Jones, who's banged it down the field to McLean.
Square 6.
A clever tackle by Brown, and McLean is beaten. From Brown, the ball has gone to Kelly.
5
Then
to
from
4.
Kelly over to Smith on the left wing, but the pass is too hard, and the ball's gone over the line, about 30 yards from the Blackburn goal.
Still in square 4.
Blackburn are throwing in. The ball is being taken by throw-in is being taken by Campbell. I beg your pardon, Healess.
4 to
He has
3.
thrown it to Thornwell, who dashes forward. He slips the ball to the middle. Rosscamp seizes on it. A short dash through. Here's a great chance. He's
Back in
shot.
4 again.
Mercer, the Huddersfield goalkeeper's caught the ball, but Rosscamp rushes on. Rosscamp has bundled Mercer, and the ball to the net. It's a goal to Blackburn Rovers in well under a minute. Jove, what a sensational start.
George Allison there, showing he may have been the first, but he certainly wasn't the last commentator unable to convince us that he's doing his commentary live.
Well, everything really happened in 1927. The first Rugby International on the 15th of January, the Grand National that year, Wimbledon, the Cup Final, and, of course, Joe Davis's win in the World Snooker Championship, and also the boat race. Now, they didn't know whether the signal was getting from the launch on the river to the receiving point in Harrods Depository. So an engineer went up onto the roof of Harrods and waved a handkerchief to indicate that the signal was getting through, so the people on the launch knew they weren't wasting their time.
The voice most closely associated with the boat race is John Snagg, but he didn't start his commentaries until 1931.
I got asked to do it for a very curious reason. It was because in the August of the year before, I'd been asked at literally half an hour's notice to go to the Oval to cover the cricket match between South Africa and England. And I went down to do this and was highly commended afterwards for the excellent work I'd done at very short notice. And then about 6 weeks later, I was asked to take on the boat race because of my experience of outside broadcasts, particularly to do with the Oval. But the curious thing is that if you look up the records, you will see that on that Saturday it rained the entire time, and I never said a single solitary word, which is the sort of way that broadcasting sometimes happens by it's sometimes wiser to keep your mouth shut.
John Snagg kept his mouth open on Boat Race Day up until 1980. In the early days, the BBC could see no reason why they should pay to cover sports occasions. After all, newspapers weren't charged a fee for reporting events. The first to demand payment was the company which ran Wembley Stadium for permission to commentate on the FA Cup final of 1929. When the offer of £50 to charity was rejected, the BBC's response was to rent a flat just outside the ground. Teddy Wakelam takes up the story.
The BBC had been refused admission to Wembley. And so they asked me if I could get some chaps and make up a team with 2 BBC men, Brennan and Hodder. Could I bring 6 more to make up a team of 8, so that we could do quarter of an hour each, with one at the beginning and one at the finish, and stand in the crowd, and each at a specified time leave the ground, run to a flat outside the gates, and rush up to a microphone and talk, if possible, for a quarter of an hour until the next bloke arrived. And then, I'm afraid, the tin hat was put on the thing rather by Tommy Usher, because he ran from his position to the microphone, which was about a quarter of a mile. And by the time he arrived there, he was more or less flat out and done. However, he managed to gasp. He went, ha, 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 like that, and said, "Chelsea have scored."
Shame the final was between Bolton and Portsmouth. From 1927 onwards, the Wimbledon fortnight was covered by Captain Wakelam and, just to show consistency and selection, Colonel R.H. Brand. The BBC's athletics man was Harold Abrahams of Chariots of Fire fame. Their style, in common with many of their early colleagues, was unexcitable. An exception was horse racing's R.C. Lyle, perhaps the least successful commentator ever to work for the BBC. Here he is describing, or perhaps not, the closing moments of the 1934 derby.
Windsor Lead, it looks like Windsor Lead. Here's Colombo. Colombo will win. Colombo will win, I think. It's a terrific race. Colombo's won it, I think. But it's going to be a finish. Terrific. Windsor Lad, look, Windsor Lad's won it. No, yes, Windsor Lad. Terrific. Windsor Lad wins. Windsor Lad, East and Colombo. Windsor Lad, East and Colombo. Tiberius and Ruddin. Windsor Lad won it.
Nowadays, these early efforts may seem naive, but it should be remembered they were pioneers. There was no one to learn from, no mentors, no predecessors, no benchmarks. Many mistakes were made in those early commentaries, and not just in the identification of players. Often the wrong men were chosen for the wrong reasons. Journalists like R.C. Lyle, without the gift of the gab. Ex-sportsmen who were experts in their field, but who didn't know how to talk about it. Or wordsmiths who could conjure up a telling image, but who had no knowledge of and no real interest in sport. Sometimes commentators were chosen seemingly at random because they were in the same club or college or regiment as the chap in charge. Robert Hudson again.
In the early days, the BBC made the assumption, usually wrongly, that somebody who was very good at playing a game was necessarily good at describing it. They soon discovered that this, in fact, was not the case. Sometimes it is, but not often. And the emphasis gradually moved round to finding commentators who were extremely good broadcasters and who had absorbed the technique of radio commentary and giving them, on many occasions, an expert summarizer sitting beside them.
It was thought it was a commentator's job only to describe the action, and that it was beyond their brief to give an overall picture of the setting. In fact, for big sporting events like the Grand National, specialists were brought in just to set the scene and provide so-called colour, before the proper commentator took over. Our man at Wembley or Twickenham or White City never allowed himself to get involved enough to get too excited. The word that perhaps best describes the early commentators is, well, amateur. No one could have lived on the fees the BBC paid anyway. What's changed? They were certainly amateurs compared to the all-round professionals who came later, who were able to describe the whole scene, let the listener know where the ball was without the help of a number two, and who could generate excitement when the play was exciting. The man who brought about the revolution was Seymour de Lotbiniere, who took over the outside broadcasting department in 1935.
The modern technique of radio commentary really evolved through the head of outside broadcast, who was in charge just before the war and also after the war, and that was Seymour de Lotbiniere, whom we all called Lobby. Incidentally, he was 6 foot 8 inches tall. But he evolved the modern technique of radio commentary, which is basically to keep the listener behind the commentator's eyes and describe the play in relation to the position of the commentator. That is to say, the bowler in cricket running towards you from the far end, running away from you, the ball being hit by a right-handed batsman away to the left, that is the cover point, and so on. And that is applied to every sport.
The technique of allowing the listener to see the action through the eyes of the commentator was as revolutionary as the Fosbury flop was to high jumping. Everyone adopted it. De Lotbiniere, or Lobby, ruled his department as a benevolent dictator. He would hold a briefing meeting every Monday morning, at which his words, "programs since we last met," would send a chill round those present, as he went on to dissect every broadcast. No error would go unnoticed. But he also gave out praise where it was due. The result was that within a year of taking over, Lobby had assembled a team who did things his way. There were inevitable slip-ups, where the commentator failed to do his job, such as, well, Seymour de Lotbiniere himself at the 1939 boat race. Here's Lobby setting the scene.
There was a time when we decided to cover the boat race, as always, from a launch with John Snagg, but for once we thought we'd have an aeroplane, and I went up in it, and I must admit, due to the fact that the aeroplane had to go round and round because it was going a great deal faster than the boats, I gradually got more and more airsick. And I remember towards the end of the race, when John Snagg handed over to ask from the aircraft who was in the lead, rather despairingly saying, "Oxford in the lead by 2 lengths back to the launch." And I think this gave a fairly genuine impression to everybody listening that I was being very airsick. And in fact, I was feeling pretty uncomfortable.
So, however, the airplane still seemed to be there around about Barnes Bridge, so I called it up again, and I said, "It looks to me as though Cambridge are in the lead by something like 3 lengths. As the aeroplane is still there, we go over to our commentator in the aeroplane." And rather a strangled voice gave what I think is the shortest commentary ever.
Well, now, as we come round the final bend, with about 2 minutes to go before the finish, we'll hear once again from the aeroplane flying overhead. Cambridge leading by 3.5 good lengths. Back to the launch.
Some major sports were thought to be unsuitable for radio. Bernard Darwin of the Times was the BBC's golf man from 1927 up to the war, but only after and never during the event. He would give eyewitness accounts of up to 15 minutes reporting on the Open, or, just as important then, the Amateur Championship. It was thought, not least by Darwin himself, that live golf would never make good radio. The same was thought to be true of cricket. Again, it was in 1927 that cricket was first tried. Teddy Wakelam and Alan Howland commentated on an afternoon's play between Surrey and Middlesex. Unfortunately, the play was so dull that Wakelam later wrote, "That afternoon put paid to cricket for a long time as a real running commentary sport." The man who showed how it could be done was Howard Marshall. Here's Robert Hudson again.
Howard Marshall was the first real voice of cricket who made an impact, and he was the first commentator who had the ability to combine description of the play with his visual impressions of the whole scene. And of course the art of commentary is the combination of the action and the scene.
Marshall's became the most important voice on radio during the summers of 1934 and 1938, when Australia came to England and Don Bradman was at his peak. But not everyone appreciated Marshall's use of the English language, as on one occasion when he was discussing the great Australian spinner Bill O'Reilly.
I remember getting into trouble when O'Reilly was bowling well, and I suddenly broke into song. Said, "If you're the O'Reilly they speak of so highly, God blimey, O'Reilly, you are bowling well." which in the days when they were rather more sensitive about difficult words than they are today.
Well, we've checked and we are allowed to say gorblimey on air. Marshall was once asked about the greatest memory of his commentary career. He had no hesitation in harking back to the Oval in 1938.
I must say the great Hutton record, and he beat Bradman's record, at the Oval. I remember we were sitting on a blazing hot day on the tin roof of the Oval stand as he was gradually approaching the record, and Bradman crowding him all he could, try and snap up a catch, and Hutton getting paler and paler and paler, more ghost-like. And then the final triumph and the roar of applause. Wonderful day, wonderful occasion.
They're singing. Terrific reception, the whole crowd standing up and cheering all around the ground, thousands of them all standing up. Bradman's been rushed over to shake Hutton by the hand. The whole Australian team have congratulated him, and now everybody cheering.
The commentator who most fully epitomised Lobby's vision was another military man, Commander Tommy Woodruff. He'd mastered many sports, football, boxing, athletics, horse racing, through sheer hard work. If others thought their job began at kick-off, well, that was their lookout.
And if they got a chap they thought could give commentary, they let him loose. And said, well, now, you're going to give a commentary on Shove Halfpenny. What do you know about Shove Halfpenny? Nothing. All right, go and find out all about it. So away you went and learnt up Shove Halfpenny, which is much easier to learn up than commentary, actually. You got the jargon. I mean, before racing, I used to go and hang around race courses, rather like a kind of a spiv, you know, just to hear how racing people talk. And you did the same for football. You met footballers, you met everybody you could to connect with the thing, and just talk to them. And you listened for their little phrases and what they said. Same with boxing. And if you did that enough, you could give the impression on the air that you knew the hell of a lot about what you were talking about.
On one occasion, Woodruff got into trouble because he didn't know what someone else was talking about. That someone was Adolf Hitler, as he opened the Berlin Olympic Games of 1936. Listeners actually complained that he kept interrupting the Führer's speech. At one point, he declared himself to be bored stiff. The only moment he perked up was when Hitler stopped talking.
Ich verkünde die Spiele von Berlin zur Feier der 11. Olympiade neuer Zeitrechnung als eröffnet.
That was Herr Hitler announcing it open. Now they're all cheering him, and the whole crowd have raised their right arms.
After George Allison took on the manager's job at Arsenal, he carried on commentating, except when his own team was playing. In 1938, though, Tommy Woodruff was given the FA Cup final, and it turned out to be a very long stint at the microphone. There was no score, as the match went into the last minute of extra time. Woodruff, talking to Eamon Andrews in 1964, takes up the story.
I had said in that last minute, like a bit of an ass, that I'd eat my hat if anybody scored. And within 30 seconds, little Much, a dark little fella, he scored from the penalty. That was that.
And isn't it true that, in fact, you were shown on television eating your hat?
I was, yes. It was the trouble with that was I had to eat two, because I eat one on rehearsal and one on transmission. So I was rather sick of hats at the end of it.
Every time a ball comes anywhere near the Huddersfield penalty area, somebody in the Preston side has a huge wang at it. Another goal kick for Huddersfield. And I'll eat my hat if there's any score before this whistle goes. How long is it?
Just a minute.
A minute to go, and no score at Wembley in the Cup final of 1938.
20 seconds later, this happened.
And Hesper's just taken a goal kick, and it's gone past the halfway line to Smith's head at Preston. He goes into the centre of the field again. Everybody has a bit of a kick at it, and finally beat it. Preston inside left gets it. Passes it back to O'Donnell, who's coming too much, who's got it on the edge of the penalty area. He tries to shoot, and he's tripped. And there is a penalty. Mr. Joel has put his foot most firmly on the penalty spot. And by golly, if there's a penalty and this decides the match, it'll be a funny thing in history, because last time Huddersfield won by a penalty when these two teams played together in the Cup final in 1922. And Hesford, I wouldn't be in Hesford's position for all the tea in China. He's just licking his fingers, and he's got to stand still. Here comes Much to take it. Much is taking it. Here he comes. And it's a goal! It's a goal!
In the next programme, we look at the war years, when the OB department found its voice, and the post-war years, when great personalities emerged, like Stuart McPherson, Raymond Glendenning, and John Arlott. Until then, goodbye.
You have been listening to I'll Eat My Hat, one of a series of illustrated talks on the history of sports broadcasting on the wireless. The presenter was Mr. Desmond Lynam. It was compiled and written by Mr. Bill Matthews, with additional research by Mr. Simon Bullivant. The production assistant was Miss Elaine Wigley. The producer was Mr. Richard Edis.